Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone Season 4 Episode 14. It's called Of Late I Think of Cliffordville. So spoilers for the episode. And yes, I'm on my own. If you didn't catch the announcement video over MailFuzz Movies, Tara will no longer be recording stuff after a little bit. Unfortunately, that means that she will not be here to finish out Twilight Zone. If you're waiting on The Last Babylon 5, don't worry, we are going to do that with Tara before she wraps up. But Twilight Zone will be continuing solo, so I'm getting back into the swing of things and diving into where we left off. So, yes, of late I think of Cliffordville is the episode we're looking at. And it's a time travel story, but it's also a deal with the devil story. And there's a few things in this that I actually really like conceptually. I love the twist on the formula of what this story is, which is instead of a good person going back in time and trying to fix something and making her life better, whether intentionally or inadvertently, this is the story of a complete asshole who goes back in time because he wants to like build his empire again. It's this tycoon who has like plants and factories, and he's a rich, very rich man, especially in the time period. He's got like $36 million in like 1963. That is, you know, an obscene amount of money. And he wants to go back to when he was 30, back at the start of the century, give or take, and build up his wealth from scratch. But he thinks he's going to do it with all this knowledge he has. He knows where this oil is, and you know, in land that's next to this town, Cliffordville, that he's going to get and profit quicker. He's going to screw the people he hates quicker. All these things, only to completely mess it all up. Mostly just due to his own stupidity and his own overconfidence, right? And I think that twist on the formula is kind of fun. One of the details that I really love here, so to go back in time, he makes a deal with the devil, particularly a woman named Devlin, but you know, she's got little horns, you know, it's a whole thing. When he's given this like opportunity, when she explains that she can send them back in time and he can like relive the thrill of the chase again, he basically assumes that, oh, this all sounds quite good, I suppose the payment is my soul. And I actually really love the response to this, where she goes, actually, you're kind of a prick and we already have your soul. Like, you're already going to hell. You have ruined so many lives. You have been an awful human being your entire life. We already own your soul. We need something else. And it turns out she wants money. But I actually really love that little twist on things, that he assumes it's for the soul, but in actual fact, you're already an evil person. There's no soul to get. It is actually quite a fascinating little twist on that as well. So I really appreciate that. There are some things towards the end of the story that I do think, you know, maybe rob it of some of its uniqueness and kind of like bring it back into like normal territory. But I do like those broad ideas and those broad things, because, you know, the main gist of it is that when he does go back in time halfway through the episode, he immediately starts complaining that the roads aren't paved, and then he complains that, wait, typhoid still exists? He's like, wait, what? Haven't you ever heard of inoculations? And then he realizes and goes, oh no, wait, not yet, you haven't. I'm like, how is this not the first thing that came into your head when you were traveling back in time? Like, of course the technology and all these things that have changed, especially in this particular window of time. You've literally went back to before cars were there on the road. You've went back to horse and carriage, and like you're complaining about it as if it's a surprise. How is that not one of the first things you considered in your head when you're traveling in time? Now, you could obviously justify this and say, well, this is just how overconfident and sure of himself he is. He's so concerned with what he wants to do for his own personal greed that he doesn't even stop to think of that. Like, I get that, and that's totally fine. And this ultimately is his own demise, in fact, because when he convinces his rival, and we'll talk more about that in the opening scenes in a bit, but when he convinces his rival and this banker to sell this land that he knows has got like a shit ton of oil under it, for a price that's very, you know, healthy for him, and he uses whatever money he's got left to buy this land, the comeuppance that comes from it is that it turns out they know it had oil, but in this time period, the oil is so deep that they can't get to it. So it's not really a concern. And my thought when they said this was, well, obviously it's a shame that he used every penny he had pretty much to buy this land, because he needs to live on something in the time being. But all you have to do is literally wait, and you will be a millionaire, a billionaire in like modern money probably, but maybe at the time just millionaire, because of this oil. It's just a matter of waiting. You have effectively this guaranteed inheritance of all this oil money. You just have to wait until the drilling technology gets to the point where you can reap the rewards. Obviously, there is the one caveat to that we find out right before the end of the story, is that there is a literal monkey's paw element to this, which is actually one of the things that I don't like about the episode. I actually really like the idea that until the devil woman shows back up again at the end and says, oh, by the way, the trick is that while you asked to look like you did in this time period, internally all your organs are actually still that of a 70-plus-year-old man. That, like, I wish that wasn't there, because I actually think it is more satisfying that there was no actual monkey's paw other than his own hubris. Like, he himself screwed everything. I guess you have to do it to an extent, because at some point he would just realize, well, I guess I'll just wait, and by the time I'm in my 50s or 40s or whatever 1930 something rolls around, I'll at least become filthy rich then. He can play the waiting game, but he we have this monkey's paw element of like, no, you're actually internally still an old man, and you're not going to live to see any of that profit. Like, I appreciate why, because he fundamentally, but I think the idea that he just screws himself over and isn't patient enough is more interesting and feels like more of a poignant lesson, because he just does this to himself. And he's very deserving of it. This episode makes us hate this guy, like, immediately. The entire opening of this episode, this story, is that he invites his rival, Mr. Dietrich, to a meeting, and he's basically toying with him, and it's clear Dietrich's never liked this guy. The main character's called Feathersmith, and Feathersmith has been this awful person his entire life. He's got this awful habit where he chooses cigars and like spit things out, and it is actually quite disgusting. He brings him to this meeting to tell Dietrich that one of the last things he ever really wanted to accomplish was to take Dietrich's own factory from him, his own plant. And he reveals that he knows Dietrich took out a loan for $3 million on his workplace and his business, and that he's purchased this loan from whoever he got this loan from. And it's a loan that's payable on demand. So now he can ask for this loan money back, and this will bankrupt Dietrich, and he takes glee in this. He laughs maniacally over the comms. I actually think this is a really good opening scene to establish just how much of an evil person he is, how much of like a Scrooge type character he is, and how this other guy Dietrich seems like he's a wealthy enough guy seemingly, but he's more down to earth. He seems like the more likable one. There are some little things here, and some of this is just because obviously this has been beautifully remastered and we're watching this in HD now, but you can see where the ball cap is on Feathersmith, on the actor, because obviously this actor's much younger, because we're going to be traveling back in time to see him when he's 30 years old. So all this stuff where they're older, most of the old age makeup honestly is not too bad. I think it works well enough. Certainly on 1960s TV levels, it's going above and beyond. It's just once you notice the bald cap line, it is kind of hard to not see it. So I will mention that, but it's not like a huge deal breaker by any means. He actually puts a hat on for some of his scenes, which is much better. Helps out quite a bit. But I thought that scene was good, and I thought the scene afterwards where he has this conversation with the janitor, the custodian of the top 3 floors, who talks to him about how he's been there for 30 years and got a gold watch for being there for so long. And this is the scene where Feathersmith basically starts talking about, I got my start in Cliffordville, I built my fortune from there from the ground up, and he's basically lost the thrill of the chase because he's achieved everything he wanted. Taking this final business from Dietrich was his final goal, and the custodian points out, Hecat's his name, he points out, a quote from Alexander the Great is that, he had no worlds left to conquer, so therefore he's kind of lost his will to live. And that's when he goes to the elevator, Feathersmith, and he ends up on this 13th floor with the Devil Woman who gives him this offer. One of the big things for this season of Twilight Zone has been talking about if the episodes feel like they're padded out to fit the hour-long format versus the half-hour format. And I think for the most part, I like what most of the runtime of this episode does to add to the episode. It definitely feels like it's got more room to breathe, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think all of these scenes early on get a lot to breathe, but they all do a really good job of establishing this character, establishing some of the people that are going to pop up in the past, and establishing what his motivations are, and making us dislike him. And I think the scene with the Devil Woman is also very good. One of the few scenes that I do feel are a bit padded out and just tagged on just to inflate the runtime by a few minutes is the transition to the past, because there's a whole scene where he goes to he's on a plane as if he's actually literally journeying into the past, and then he's on a train when he arrives in the town, and the plane scene especially, it's not that long, it's like a minute, maybe two tops, so it wouldn't get it down to the half-hour format by any means, but it did kind of feel like, oh, we have to pad it out back, we're not quite at that full runtime yet, we have to pad it out with an extra scene. And I didn't feel, unlike all the breathing room that those first few scenes had, I didn't feel like this plane scene added anything to the episode. It's not a big deal because it is just like 2 minutes, but it does feel like, oh, we're 2 minutes short, let's write in an extra scene. At the scripting stage, we're a little bit short, let's write in this extra scene of him going back. So there's not much, but it is worth mentioning. But yeah, it's very much a cathartic Tales from the Crypt-esque comeuppance episode. We get to see him be really... Because, the first thing he wants to do when he buys this land is rub it in their faces. He wants to tell them that he's just swindled them because this land has oil. And he's laughing. And then he doesn't understand why they're not, concerned. And then they explain that there's oil there, but no one on Earth can dig for it because it's too deep. And he starts yelling about, of course you can drill 5 miles if you have to. And they're like, well, maybe you can, but no one else can. And then he realizes that it's going to be a couple of decades before he can actually get the oil. And he's, at least until then, he is penniless. And they say that he's got a taste for crow, and they laugh at him. And it's very cathartic. That's kind of the big point of the episode. And he goes around, there's a montage of him trying to convince mechanics and engineers to try and build modern technology that doesn't exist yet. And he's like, hey, this is this thing, this is roughly how it works. And they're like, okay, well, if you give us a blueprint, we'll build it. And he's like, I don't have a blueprint, because he doesn't understand, obviously, on an actual mechanical scientific level how certain technology works. He just has the broad strokes, which makes sense, because most of us can't explain exactly how a TV works. We can't explain exactly how a Concorde works. We know the basic principles, maybe we have the broad strokes, but we can't build one. We can't instruct one on how to build one of these things. So, that's also kind of an interesting thing that he's so determined to do this. And I really liked at this point in the episode that this was purely just his impatience. And if, he bought this land for cheap, and he just waited, and he used other knowledge that he had from the present day to live well in this time period, maybe do something that he can achieve with what knowledge he has that doesn't involve building actual technology, I don't really have an obvious answer off the top of my head, but I feel like there's probably some things you could achieve without having to rely on modern technology. And in that case, you could bide your time. Again, this is before we find out that he's on the inside still an old man and won't live to see any of this, but I think you could. And I think it had a bit more power to me before the Devil Woman showed up and goes, oh, by the way, you're still 75 years old on the inside, so you're probably going to be dead before you see any of the benefits of any of this. That to me kind of felt like, okay, we're just doing the monkey's paw thing, and I didn't think it needed it. It was more powerful when his own hubris and his own like vindictiveness screwed him over, because it made its point, you know, to himself. Like, he already like ruined his own life by doing this, and by trying to convince people that they could be millionaires by building like technology that doesn't exist yet. He came out as a laughingstock, and people were laughing at him. And this was, you know, like, you know, Rod at the end, when Rod Serling comes back in and says, you know, he tried to like run the same track again, but found that it was much muddier than he remembered. Like, you know, that's something that comes up. You know, one of the things he wanted was to marry the daughter of one of the guys. So he's got his rival that he buys the land from, but the other guy he buys the land from is this banker, and his daughter is this woman he fondly speaks of and says that he wants to like marry her, he wants to woo her. But when he actually meets her in this backstory, when he says to the banker, "Hey, you've got a daughter, may I meet her?" You know, she's like stuffing like cake in her face, and she's got like a big mole, and it's going out of its way that she's not quite this perfect image in his head. Like, his memory has built this nostalgia around her being this perfect woman, and instead she's not quite living up to that when he actually gets to meet her. And he's like, "Hey, have you got another daughter? Maybe I'm misremembering which daughter I'm thinking of." And there isn't another daughter. So again, it's this idea of like his view of the past and his view of what he expects not being quite what it adds up to be. Like, I really liked those elements of it, because it is just kind of his own attitude that's kind of his own downfall, and it feels like he deserves it because he is awful to people. It's not like he's just made like a name for himself. He wants to rub it in people's faces. He wants to lord it over them. You know, when he runs into the young version of the janitor from the 60s, you know, he runs into him and he kind of says, "Oh, you've got a future ahead of you," and he's, you know, he very much belittles him. And at the end of the episode, because it wants its Twilight Zone ending, so the Devil Woman says, like, "I'll send you back to 1963, but," and this is kind of like a Back to the Future type thing, is that it'll be a 1963 based on what you've done now. Like, what you've done in the past now will affect the 1963 you go back to. And I'm like, okay, that's quite interesting. But he has to go and sell the land that he bought to make the $40 that she wants, the price that she wants for sending him back. So he quickly finds this young version of the janitor and sells him this land. And then he goes back to 1963. And unlike when he goes back to the past earlier on, it just cuts to like how things are different. We don't see him like see or discover how things are different, which I think was a mistake. I think I would have taken out the plain stuff of him going back to the past, and I would have much rather seen his reaction to the fact that he is now the custodian of the top 3 floors, and this guy that he belittled is now the rich guy who owns the building because he had this land with all the oil. And it does this extra thing that, like, I get what it's maybe implying here, because this guy who's now in charge, this custodian who's now the rich man, he's now kind of awful and kind of laughs about how he's the rich man and how, maybe if you apply yourself, Feathersmith, maybe you'll, you know, make something of yourself. You know, he's kind of belittling the main character now that he's the one who's rich. And, you know, like, that's like, I get what it's doing there. Like, it's a fine point to say that, like, money corrupts, right? And that power corrupts, and that maybe he's now not that kind because he's become this. In fact, I was even thinking as well that earlier on in the episode, when this first scene happens where the custodian's talking to him, and it's this conversation about how he's longing for the thrill of the chase again, and it's the custodian who brings up this Alexander the Great quote about not having worlds left to conquer. I was actually thinking for a moment, are we in some kind of loop where the custodian is intentionally like influencing his decision to want to go to the past because he was already the rich one, went back and changed it, and now he's poor and he's the custodian, and now he's convincing him to go back and change things back? I was thinking that briefly just because it kind of felt like he was influencing him in that scene a little bit. I was just sort of thinking back at the end to that, and I was like, oh, it kind of seems like he was almost pushing Feathersmith to want to go back and change things. But maybe I'm grasping at like some straws there. I'm not really sure. I'd be curious to see what other people think about that particular element in the comments. But I will say, I don't know if I needed this, oh, the custodian is now an asshole because he has the money part at the end. Like that, plus the whole monkey's paw of like, oh, he's going to die and he's actually still quite old on the inside in the past. I think those two elements felt a little bit unnecessary to me, and they felt like, oh, we're tacking on some extra, you know, not extra twists per se, but extra kind of like gotchas to the characters by the end. That I think it didn't really need. It felt like a nice, it almost felt like it was more earnest and heartfelt when it was just, no, this asshole is going to ruin his own life. And we can enjoy that and we can learn the lessons from that without having to murky it up by, no, the devil was going to screw him anyway. Because it didn't really need that. He screwed himself. And then the extra part where, no, this nice guy turns out he's going to be an asshole because he has money. I also felt like that was maybe a little bit more, not mean-spirited, but just a little bit more dour than we needed. Like, it was almost like we got a happy ending because the asshole screwed himself, right? And we could take solace in that. And there were still some valuable lessons to learn from there. But the ending kind of paints it as, no, like, whoever has the money is going to turn out to be a prick. And that, like, it feels like maybe we didn't need that extra bit of negativity in this particular story. Especially since Dietrich, the other guy who was, like, kind of okay and wealthy and had the other plan that Feathersmith wanted at the start of the episode, it felt like he was a more sympathetic guy who was, like, a business owner, who was doing all right for himself, you know, aside from needing the loan to keep the business going, but was managing and was going fair enough until this other asshole, you know, came in and, like, basically swindled him in 1963. I think, like, the idea of, like, you can be a decent person, you know, in that position was maybe a more nuanced approach to this, as opposed to just, no, if you get this much money, you're just going to be awful. And maybe it's true. I'm not saying that there's not some truth to maybe this. Like, sure, I get it. I get the point it's maybe making, but it did feel like an extra thing tacked on at the end, separate from the story it was telling. But hey, you know, like, it's a minor critique, ultimately, I guess, because I think the bulk of the episode is quite interesting to watch, because it is this asshole just kind of being a victim of his own hubris, and I think that is quite entertaining. It's got a moral tale to go along with it. So it's not a bad episode. Like, I think it's a pretty solid enough episode, if not an exceptional one, that you're going to remember as one of the great Twilight Zone episodes. So that's my thoughts on, of late, I think, of Cliffordville. So we'll have a look in next episode. Obviously, Rod comes out at the end, as he always does, and tells us about it. I'll read the description on IMDb, but the episode's called The Incredible World of Horace Ford. And the description as follows is, toy maker Horace Ford is increasingly preoccupied with memories of his childhood, endangering his job and marriage. But a visit to his old neighborhood brings a haunting encounter, suggesting the time was not as idyllic as he yet remembers. This is interesting because not only have we had several episodes of Twilight Zone where it's about someone longing for their past, this even kind of feels like it shares some themes with this episode that we just talked about, because it's about someone, you know, having these idyllic visions of the past, but it's not as good. Obviously, this is maybe a little different than wanting to go back so he can exploit it and make money quicker and whatever else, but it does feel like it has some crossover in themes. And I think we've had a lot of these, you know, these Twilight Zones where there's two episodes back to back that share something, where, you know, we get to the end, we look at the next one and go, hey, that sounds like it's got a couple of things from this one. Yeah, that feels like we've encountered that phenomena again here with these Twilight Zones. But interesting anyway. The little clip they showed at the end did seem to have him think that he was seeing people from his youth as kids when there actually should be his age, and his wife is concerned about it. That seemed to be the clip, but I'm curious. You know, it seems like an interesting enough episode. But you know, the rating on IMDb does not fill me with a massive amount of confidence. But you know, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, that's next time on Twilight Zone. So hopefully you enjoyed my thoughts on this one. Please do let me know what you think of this episode in the comments. Hit the like button. It helps people find the reviews and find the channel. And if you want to support me, you know, even more so, you can go over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, and you can support all the content and help keep it all coming, both in MailFuzz TV and MailFuzz Movies, by going over there and getting some bonuses and supporting with some monies. But that is the show. So thank you very much for joining me. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.